Good morning, everyone. As agreed at the Assemblies annual meeting on the 14th of May 2021, the Confirmation Hearings Committee is allowed to appoint a chair on a meeting-by-meeting basis for the 2021 to 2022 Assembly year. For the first item of business, I will conduct an election for the chair for this meeting in accordance with the GLA's standing orders. In the event of one candidate being nominated, I will declare the nominated candidate chair of the Confirmation Hearings Committee for this meeting. A proposer and seconder is required for each nomination. In the event of two candidates being nominated, I will ask for votes in favour of each candidate. Are there any nominations?
I'd like to nominate Peter Fortune, AM.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to second that nomination? That's great. Are there any other nominations? Then I declare that Assembly Member Fortune is elected Chairman of the Confirmation Hearings Committee for today's meeting.
Thank you very much, and by an extraordinary piece of luck, I happen to be sitting in the chair already. This is an extraordinary meeting of the Confirmation Hearings Committee. Under Section 1.7 of the Authority's Standing Orders, I confirm that this meeting be called by the Chair of the London Assembly as a matter of urgency in order to hold a confirmation hearing for the Mayor's proposed appointee to the Office of Deputy Chair of Transport for London within 3 weeks of the notification received from the Mayor, in accordance with Section 100B, subsection 4B of the Local Government Act 1972. We move to agenda item 3, which is apologies for absence and the Chair's announcements. Can I now welcome everyone to this meeting of the Confirmation Hearings Committee. Also welcome Assembly Member Pidgeon, who is with us in the ether and is attending this meeting as an observer under Standing Order 8.2 and will be participating in the discussion at agenda item 6. Can you please make sure that your electric devices are switched to silent and that they're moved away from the microphones as well, please. Can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies have been received from Assembly Member Cooper, for whom Assembly Member Ahmad is attending as a substitute, Assembly Member Hall, for whom Assembly Member Rogers is attending as a substitute, and Assembly Member Sahota, for whom Assembly Member Desai is attending as a substitute.
Thank you. Moving to agenda item 4, which is declarations of interest. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out in item 4 and ask Assembly members if they have any other disclosable pecuniary interests to declare? I see none. Can I also invite Seb Dance to declare any interests relevant to the business of this meeting or in relation to the proposed appointment?
None to declare, Chair.
Thanks very much. So the minutes, can we confirm the minutes of the meeting of the committee held on the 23rd of November 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record? That's agreed, which moves us to the meat of the meeting, which is the confirmation section for the office of, agenda item 6, which is confirmation hearing in respect to the appointment to the office of the Chair of the Mayor's Cultural Leadership Board. I think that's wrong. I think we'll do this for Transport for London today. Apologies, there's some technical difficulties there. Can I welcome Seb to the meeting, please? Seb Dance to the meeting. The committee will be putting questions to you in relation to your proposed appointment to the Office of Deputy Chair of TfL. However, can I first ask members to A, note the background information circulated within the agenda for the meeting, and note the supplementary information which was received after publication of the agenda, which is Seb Dance's CV and key issues and priorities for TfL. Fabulous. Okay, we now move on to the question and answer session, and I shall be kicking off. Seb, thanks again for coming along. Question 1 for me is around the experience that you have for the role of Deputy Chair of Transport for London. Can you tell us a bit about what experience you've got?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair, for the question. And if I may begin by thanking you. You're all so far away, but thanking you for being here today and for giving up your time to listen to me this morning. I'm extremely grateful. And if I may, Chair, might I also thank my predecessor, Heidi Alexander, who did an excellent job as Deputy Mayor and as Deputy Chair for Transport for London. And I'd also like to extend my gratitude to her for the generosity that she's given me in terms of the time that she's given to help ease me into this role. And I'd also like to extend that thanks to the team at the GLA, who have been wonderful as well. It is a real privilege and a real honour to be here before you today. I was born in London. This is the city that I love. It's the best place in the world, and I can think of no greater honour than to be asked to serve that city and to serve Londoners, and I look forward to working with you all should you decide to recommend my appointment to the Mayor. Your question, Chair, was around my relevant experience for the role. And I think, obviously, there are a great many number of skills that are required for this particular post. And I would like to begin by outlining what I believe are the 5 key skills that are required, and then talking about how my experience relates to those 5 key skills. I think first and foremost, it's essential to have knowledge of policy making and policy development. Secondly, it's essential to have knowledge of oversight of large and complex institutions. Thirdly, it's important to have knowledge of dealing with stakeholders both internally and externally. Fourth, it's important to have the ability to negotiate and to achieve and build consensus around ideas for going forward. And the 5th element is to have a real passion for transport and an understanding of the importance of transport in the lives of everyday Londoners. I'd like to outline how my experience in my most recent relevant role as Member of the European Parliament for London ascribes to each of those skills that I have outlined. I was a Member of the European Parliament from 2014 to 2020 for London. I was the Vice Chair of the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety Committee, which is the largest committee in the European Parliament in terms of the volume of legislation it passes. I was the Deputy Leader of the European Parliamentary Labour Party. I was the spokesperson for my political group on air quality, and I was the coordinator for my political group in the Committee of Inquiry into Automotive Emissions, which is the so-called Dieselgate scandal. So for the first skill set that I outlined, policy making, it is obviously essential as a representative and a member of the European Parliament to understand how policy is formulated and how it's developed. And during my role, I was a rapporteur and shadow rapporteur on a number of key files to do with environmental legislation and indeed in the transport sector, looking at elements of vehicle regulation such as vehicle emissions. Understanding how policy is developed through the various institutions, how it's influenced, and the outcomes that people expect through that process is an essential part of this job. In terms of oversight, as my position as the coordinator in the Committee of Inquiry into the automotive sector, that role encompassed having oversight of a very complex regulatory regime between member states of the European Union and their own vehicle industries and the Commission as well. And in that Committee of Inquiry, we had to navigate the various ways in which motor vehicle companies worked with the regulators, and to distill that into a very succinct form of recommendations then to take to the Commission to ensure that a Dieselgate scandal could never happen again. In terms of managing stakeholders internally and externally, as a member of the European Parliament, I was obviously subject to representations from a great many sectors, many of whom, of course, based in London, many of whom operated Europe-wide. And, of course, one has to take into account the various interest groups, including, of course, constituents here in London and businesses and political interests as well back home. Managing the expectations of stakeholders, making them feel as if they are part of the process and listening and engaging with them so that they have an active interest in how policy is developed is, again, another important skill set that I developed as a member of the European Parliament. In terms of negotiation, the 4th skill set that I mentioned, negotiation is an integral part of policy making and policy development. And as a member of the European Parliament, I had to negotiate not just with different political groups, obviously with whom one might expect I don't have a natural affinity, but also across differences within my own political group as well. You have to remember, of course, people came from 28 different member states with very different political traditions. And so understanding where they come from, the way in which they approach ideas, and finding a way to build a consensus that pleases as many people as possible, whilst making sure that everybody, because you often can't please everybody, making sure that everybody feels as if they've had a stake in that process was a key part of the work that I did. And finally, passion for transport. Most of the files that I worked on the environment had an obvious transport link. I've mentioned the link between vehicle emissions and emission standards. That was a key part of the work that I did. But I was also involved in regulation for the procurement of zero-emission bus fleets for local authorities, development of cross-border networks and electrification of cross-border transport systems through the 10T initiative. And I think it's fair to say that when it comes to the environment and transport, there is an obvious and inextricable link. Cities, regions, for the action that they need to take on the fight against climate change, transport is front and centre of that, and it's one of the key levers. And this major lever that we have to pull is one that we have to concentrate all minds on and involve everybody in a combined effort to ensure that we reduce our carbon emissions. The experience that I got at a European level is also augmented by experiences that I've had elsewhere in the public sector, the private sector, and indeed in government. In the private sector, through managing clients and talking them through how regulation at a European and a UK level is formulated and the impact that that will have on their various sectors. In the voluntary sector, through my work at ActionAid UK, where I worked closely with the government and with other political parties to try and find areas of common interest and build on campaigns that delivered on our aims of alleviating poverty around the world, and in UK government in my role as a special advisor to the Northern Ireland office, where managing stakeholders who clearly, traditionally, historically have never got on, to put it mildly, was a key part of the job that I did. So I hope that I've outlined some of the experiences that I've had that make me a suitable candidate for the skill set that I've outlined, and I very much look forward to working with all of you to make London a very much better place to live, work and to visit.
Thank you very much. And you know what you've highlighted there are a number of deeply complex jobs and work streams. And I think, you know, moving into TfL, there's nothing that's not complex about some of the challenges that we face here, not just in terms of the funding, but environmental responsibilities as well. So what's really important for that team at the top that's driving this is commitment. I'm a relatively new member of the London Assembly, but I noticed already that the mayor's had, what, three deputy mayors in the last 6 years. So something that I think we're really going to need, that the Commissioner's going to need, that the Mayor's going to need, is that commitment that whoever steps into that role as deputy is fully on board, if you'll excuse the pun. So will you be able to commit to this role at least until the end of the mayoral term?
Thank you, Chair. That's a very good question, because obviously commitment is key. You mentioned the various challenges that there are and the complexity of this. And it's certainly the case that in the 2 weeks that I've been Deputy Mayor, the challenges and the complexity has become obvious and very apparent to me. I can give you that commitment 100%, absolutely. I mean, as I say at the beginning, the honour that I feel at being asked to serve the city that I was born in and love very, very deeply is insurmountable. And you know, every day I pinch myself that I've been asked to perform this role. So you have my assurance that you have my commitment.
Thank you very much. So that's that commitment for the end of the mayoral term. That's appreciated. Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Seb. You've outlined some very interesting experience that you've got, you gained in the European Parliament. A lot of it's on the regulation side of things. So I just wonder, could you tell us, have you been involved in delivering any major projects, especially major infrastructure projects?
Yes. In terms of the regulation side of things, obviously they lead to discussions with local authorities and cities around the world. So the work that we did, particularly on procurement for low emission, zero emission bus fleets, that involved working directly with cities and regions within the member states themselves. So the complexity, obviously, of regulating at a European level is that you have very many different moving parts at different stages. And as a member of the European Parliament, your role is primarily to insert yourself, obviously, in the European sector. But what we had to do to get that delivery, demonstrable delivery, and show people that cities can make a real difference, was to visit those cities, was to talk to the mayors directly, was to get their input and to try and, in effect, not bypass, but certainly add an additional layer of pressure on the Commission and indeed member state governments. And if that pressure was coming directly from city mayors, from city regions, as it often did, then it meant that we could get very much better regulation overall. So in terms of delivery of projects, that meant, for example, that, that the standards that cities were held to for procurement of new buses was made very much stronger, and it meant that contracts could be signed in confidence for new vehicles that met very much stricter standards than would otherwise have been the case. So it's a slightly roundabout way of saying that through the regulation and through working out where the actual pressure points were, you can actually then end up delivering real specific outcomes at a city level.
Thank you. But you've never been sort of an accountable, responsible person within the structure of a major capital project in the same way that you would be as Deputy Chair of TfL?
In terms of delivery of a major capital project and being directly accountable, no, I wouldn't say that there was an obvious example of that. But as with many other briefs that I picked up as a member of the European Parliament, I'm a very fast learner.
And I wonder, you've got Andy Byford, who is one of the, if not the, I don't want his head to get too big, but one of the best transport practitioners we have, and Sadiq Khan, who obviously has a lot of experience as chair of TfL. What do you bring to the table that neither of those do?
Yeah, well, obviously I can't rival Andy Byford's experience in terms of running major transport systems. Train Daddy is the name he acquired in New York for very good reasons. He knows what he's doing when it comes to running a complex system and complex network, of course. The one thing that I would say is that, in this position, you have to coordinate a lot of different interested parties and stakeholders. So building relationships is really at the core of this role. It is essential, for example, that boroughs feel that they have adequate consultation and input in the processes that we are putting in place for promoting active transport, for example. We know that 95% of all the roads in London are owned and controlled by the boroughs. Therefore, we can't deliver on our commitments unless we have an active and open and honest relationship with all 32 boroughs in the City of London. And that requires an awful lot of management to ensure that people feel that they are properly involved. Obviously, we have a huge array of third-party contractors as well that work with TfL, that help deliver our services, that help manage our assets. Again, that requires an enormous amount of work and oversight. And of course, crucially, the board of TfL, which provides that management oversight of the executive functions at TfL. Being the deputy chair of that board means that every board member feels as if they have played a part and are playing a part, an active part, in the delivery of the transport system in London, that concerns are raised properly and adequately, both to the Commissioner and to the Mayor. And that's why this role is so pivotal in ensuring that that flow of communication takes place. And to put it frankly, I don't think the Commissioner would have time to be able to manage that process in addition to running the transport system.
Thank you. You've touched on some of these points, but what do you feel will be the main challenges for you as Deputy Chair of TfL and Deputy Mayor for Transport, and how would you overcome those challenges?
Yes, thank you for that question. The challenges are legion. I'm not going to pretend that this is a particularly easy time for anyone to be entering this post, but particularly, of course, at the moment that we are in the stage of the pandemic that we are, having seen the hit to TfL's finances. In terms of the challenges that we face, I think there are three fundamental challenges, but the first and primary one, and it relates to the other two as well, is of course funding. We have a situation where during the peak of the pandemic, ridership fell by 95%. Now it's a question of historical decisions that have been made, successive decisions in 2010 and then in 2015 by the previous mayor, that have seen our reliance on government funding fall dramatically. There is no longer the £2 billion capital funding that London used to get to run its transport system. This is actually fairly unusual when it comes to the international scene. If you look at our reliance on fares, it's some 2/3 of income from fare revenue alone, whereas in big cities like Paris and New York, they receive less than half of their funding through fares and the majority through government, either state or federal. So we are dealing with a historical challenge where our fare revenue has fallen dramatically. The support from government that we would otherwise have relied on has fallen dramatically. And it's really through the very good management of TfL finances that we've managed to get through a large portion of that pandemic, relying on the cash flow that we had built up. In fact, we were due for a surplus in the financial year starting in a few months' time. That obviously, unfortunately, is now not going to happen. We are not going to run a surplus. And of course, we have had to ask the government for support in the day-to-day management of transport services. What we really don't want is to continue to have to ask government for short-term extensions. It's a bit like pressing the snooze button on the alarm. Now, we all do it sometimes because, we can't face the reality of getting up early, but we have to sometimes just grasp the nettle. It's not possible for London's transport system to operate on these short-term extensions. Okay, it's one thing to say that we're running the network adequately, that we're providing sufficient bus, tube, rail services across the city. But what about the long-term capital decisions that need to be made, the investment decisions that need to be made? What about giving confidence to investors that they can put money into our transport system and recognise that they will get a return? So all of these decisions are dependent on long-term financial support from the government, and that's really what we are asking for, and that's our main concern. And of course, I know that everyone here will be working towards the same outcome as well. But the second major challenge is to deliver the transport strategy, which at its core makes London a better place to work, live and to visit. And that is making sure that 80% of all journeys across our capital by 2041 are made either by public or active transport, that is walking and cycling. It's a hugely ambitious target, but it's necessary. It's necessary not only to make this city a much better place to be in, but also, of course, to deliver on the most pressing and most urgent concern that we have, which is, of course, climate change. We have to reduce our carbon emissions. We have to contribute significantly to reducing the nation's carbon emissions. And if we get this right, we can export what we've done here in London and work with other cities around the world and then have a real impact on global emissions, because it starts with cities and it starts with transport. The third real challenge is to make sure that the relationships that we rely on to deliver that effective transport system, so that people have confidence in the system that we're running, to make sure that those relationships are well managed, effectively managed, and that people feel that they have an open and active stake in what we're doing. And all of those three challenges rely effectively on the first challenge. If we don't get funding, if we don't have an adequately funded transport system, we can't deliver on a reduction in car use, in an increase in active transport, in an increase in public transport. And certainly the relationships that we depend on will start to fray significantly. So that funding issue really does overshadow so much of what we do.
Thank you. You've mentioned the Mayor's Transport Strategy, which has the three core themes of healthy streets, healthy people and a good public transport experience, and new homes and jobs. What does success look like for that strategy, and what would your role be in ensuring the strategy's success?
Yes, thank you. So the Mayor's Transport Strategy in 2018 is effectively the blueprint for ensuring that this city is a better place to work, live and visit. And yes, a lot has changed, obviously, since the formulation of that strategy in the context that it's operating in. But at its heart, the recommendations, the policy initiatives that it has in it are extremely ambitious, and they are the right long-term ambitions for London. So enabling people to have confidence in our city streets, that they feel they can walk and cycle safely in them day and night, to ensure that the transport system is clean, safe and reliable, to ensure that we target our infrastructure into maximising housing and economic growth. That is the core aim of the Mayor's Transport Strategy. And for me, success would look like achieving all of those goals, but also, of course, meeting and hopefully exceeding the 80% target for journeys across our capital to be by public or active transport. Already, we're at some 65%, which is an extraordinary figure. 65% of journeys already in our capital are by public or active transport. So we have if you like, to put in that extra effort to get to that 80%, and that's the hardest bit, is always the final effort. But look, the transport system is effectively the skeleton on which so much of life in this city depends. And we have to nourish that skeleton, we have to make sure it's strong and properly funded. So for me, dealing with the three challenges that I outlined, they are the way to achieve the success of the Mayor's transport strategy. And I will be focusing on those three challenges throughout the work that I do. And in assuring that, I'm pretty confident that we can make and exceed the target of 80% of all journeys by 2041 being active or public transport.
Thanks very much. It was interesting listening to you talk about the comparisons with the London network and other networks. Actually, we had this conversation on Friday with the Commissioner, and when he was talking about that funding and that funding that's received from government. Because one of the other differences you see with some of those international networks is wider road user charging, so bridge tolls, etc. And we've started to see some of that be rolled out here with expanding ULEZ zones, etc. So that road user charging, or the expansion of that road user charging, is that something that you think is necessary, something you would support?
Yes, thank you. It's a good question, and obviously it relates to policy that we've already outlined in the Mayor's transport strategy in 2018, road user charging being a clear option going forward. Let's look at the history of road user charging in London. The congestion charge was revolutionary. I mean, in terms of initiatives at city level, in terms of initiatives that were then copied and used elsewhere in the world, the congestion charge really was the model, world first. But of course, it was rather blunt in terms of the way it's applied, and a reflection, I think, probably of the technological capabilities of the time. It still works very well, of course. It still reduces congestion and pollution. But, you know, over time, we've obviously augmented the congestion charge. ULEZ, for example, has been extraordinarily successful. And I think back to 2014, when I first entered the European Parliament representing London, and the issue of NOx emissions from diesel engines first really became a big public issue. And even then, it was sort of a somewhat of a niche issue. The reduction in NOx levels in the ULEZ zone has been extraordinary. And really, it shows what a simple policy can do to be effective. I think going forward, certainly, when it comes to road user charging, there will be many ideas, obviously, that come across our table that we will look at actively, that we will actively consider. And I think certainly there will be a need to look at the long-term application of road user charging, particularly as a transition to zero-emission vehicles is not the answer to the transport problems that we face. Yes, it will go a long way in reducing emissions. And you look at the bus fleet, for example, we are saving already, we're anticipating to save nearly 500,000 tons every single year of carbon emissions through a transfer to zero-emission bus fleets alone. But if we simply replicated all of the internal combustion cars out there and replaced them with zero-emission vehicles, we'd still have problems with congestion. We'd still have problems with lack of road space and road capacity. We'd also have a problem, of course, with associated emissions, even from zero-emission vehicles, of brake dust and tyre particles, which still cause problems for human health. So road user charging may well be part of that answer. Obviously, we have been asked by the government to submit proposals on additional revenue raising. I don't want to prejudice the discussions that we're having with government at the moment. We'll have a formal submission later this week. An informal one went in at the weekend. We're certainly not committed to any particular solution to the problem of congestion and emissions. We are open to ideas and looking at all ideas, but certainly I think road user charging and the increased sophistication of road user charging is definitely one of the issues and policies that we are looking at actively, but it's certainly a long way away in terms of implementation.
Thank you very much for that answer. Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting discussion. I think arguably the thing that's missing from the Mayor's transport strategy really is the dimension of price signals, and I think that is the thing that is left to address that I hope you will take up. Just to ask my questions then, earlier on you talked about visiting cities, talking to the mayors in your work on zero emission buses. When you did that, have you learned anything from those leaders in European cities that might make you question the wisdom of continuing with the Silvertown Road Tunnel project?
Thank you, Assembly Member Berry, and for your question. And for your very kind words, I should say, when you tweeted your congratulations to me. And you did say you might ask this question.
I did warn you the exact question I was going to ask, so yeah.
Indeed, thank you. Yes, I did learn an awful lot in talking to city mayors and representatives in my time. Well, not just as a member of the European Parliament, but actually since as well. The level of ambition that city mayors have is extraordinary, and it's often extremely frustrating when, during the very complex regulatory process at the European level, often the member state governments push back. You know, things are too far, they're too ambitious, they're too, and we hear this all the time, obviously too costly. But it's the city mayors who often push back and say, no, we can do this, we can deliver this. And obviously delivering savings on carbon emissions and reduction in congestion at a city level. It's something that most mayors, most cities, most regions are incredibly keen to do and incredibly passionate about as well. When it comes to infrastructure projects around Europe, I have to say it's not that encouraging when you look at other examples. There are numerous examples of big road infrastructure projects, particularly in former Eastern Bloc countries, where there is still quite a big focus on road building, on motorway building, over and above investment in rail networks. Obviously, there is a huge amount of investment going in across Europe on road networks, but there is still a really big emphasis on big road projects, 3-4 lane highways, that kind of thing. So in terms of international comparisons, there aren't actually very many that are demonstrating the level of commitment that we have in London to shifting and achieving a modal shift, a long-term modal shift from private car use to public transport and active transport. And I'm certainly not aware of many other city mayors who have emphasized the role of active transport in not just reducing congestion and improving road capacity, but also in terms of beneficial impacts on human health. We can save a huge amount, 1.7 billion to the NHS alone every year if we all walked 20 minutes or more every day. So I don't hear very many examples, but there are some, obviously. There are mayors in Scandinavia, in Oslo, in Paris, of course, Anne Hidalgo. The mayor of Rome has started talking about this as well. So it's becoming more and more apparent that this emphasis on a modal shift is the way forward. But of course, there are other ideas out there as well. Elon Musk's famous tunnel under Las Vegas, where we're all going to drive private cars, and of course, it's already snarled up with jams. I think shows us the way not to go. Your question on Silvertown. It's a great question, and I'm very aware that there is no consensus on Silvertown, and you know, that is clear and obvious. But what I would say is this: look at the problems that we have at the moment with river crossings in East London. There are very, very few, and I know because I live in that part of the city. And the few river crossings that we do are inadequate to cope with the volume of traffic that we have. And even with a reduction in traffic, they would be inadequate. The Blackwall Tunnel was built at the end of the 19th century. It was built to accommodate horses and carts. It has huge bends in it, I think, to avoid horses bolting for the sunlight, should they feel the need to. And it means that we can't run, for example, cross-river bus services through that tunnel. It's simply not possible to have the level of services that we want to link up communities in that part of the city. We can run, with the Silvertown Tunnel, an additional 37 bus services every single hour, zero-emission bus services every single hour. A huge upgrade in public transport capacity in that part of the city. It will also, of course, play a huge role in reducing congestion at the Blackwall Tunnel at the moment, which is at the moment when it closes, and it closes some 600 times, it closed in 600 times in 2019 alone. Every time you close that tunnel for just 2 minutes, you get a 3-mile backlog a traffic jam, which of course causes huge problems for the communities that are affected either side of the tunnel. And the third thing I'd say is, let's imagine a scenario, and we all want to get here, where public transport and active transport use is at that 80% level, huge reduction in private car use, everyone is driving, who does drive, a zero-emission vehicle. You would still not have sufficient capacity with the Blackwall Tunnel alone to deliver the cross-transport links that would be anticipated under that scenario. I'm very, very sympathetic to the idea that we need more pedestrian and cyclist links, and that's certainly something that we would be looking at and are looking at in terms of active projects going forward. Unfortunately, again, it returns to this primary question of funding, and that again is the number one concern that we have, because if we can get that right, then all sorts of things become possible going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very long way of saying no. So thank you very much. As you can imagine, I will continue to lobby you about that, particularly around, I think, around the transparency on cancellation costs, which is our current contretemps with the Mayor. So moving on to your personal history and work, I can see from your CV that apart from being an MEP, your previous work has actually been as a lobbyist as well. And I take a very keen interest in lobbying transparency. Now, I know there is a register of meetings with lobbyists that MEPs are encouraged to keep up to date, and the organisation Integrity Watch EU monitors this and which MEPs are using the register. And I've had a look, and I don't think you did use that register to declare your meetings. Is that right? And if so, knowing the lobbying industry as you do, why didn't you declare your meetings while you were in office?
Thank you for your question. Just to be very clear, I have never been a lobbyist. Lobbyists, in the sense that I have never sought to influence or represent a client to a policymaker. That is 100% not what I was doing in my previous roles. My most recent role in terms of working for a company that advises clients on how regulation is formulated. So I would talk about the political discussions that were taking place in the European Parliament. I would talk about the issues and how they came about and what the level of public interest would be, and I would talk about the potential impact on the sectors that I was working with. But at no point would I go and organise a meeting between a client and a policymaker in order to change policy. And the simple reason is I would feel uncomfortable talking to former colleagues and asking them to do something on behalf of someone that I was being paid by. That is not what I was doing. So I was not a lobbyist. In terms of the meetings that I had, and as a member of the European Parliament, the development of a transparency register, I don't think was and please feel free to correct me, but I wasn't aware of the ability to sign that register or to log meetings with that register. One thing I did think about certainly was publishing all the meetings that I had, but the meetings that I had were often with environmental NGOs, they were often with political groups that you would expect me to meet with trade unions and so on. And in terms of the private sector, yes, I would have meetings with sectors that were affected, but it was really with a view to understanding what the impact would be on that particular sector. And that actually, I think, is a good way to do your job as a public representative in order to understand the impact. It's certainly something that I think it has a lot of merit in terms of publishing and being open and honest about the meetings that you had. I think it would be a fairly boring read, frankly, in terms of my particular stint as a member of the European Parliament. But yes, going back, probably, I think that, yes, I think the introductory of a register sooner rather than later would have been a good thing.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I asked because I think there must have been a lot of lobbying during your work on Dieselgate, or attempts to lobby you, and the transparency there, I think, would have been useful to see. I went to see it and I couldn't see it. There are, it's too late now, but if you look on other MEPs' pages, there's a section on their meetings. So going back to what you said about your work advising clients on policy, so I understand that isn't direct lobbying of legislators, but it is advice to industry on how to achieve change. In terms of previous clients that you might have worked with. I looked in the lobbyist register for the Parliament, which we have. It was hard fought for by MEPs to get that. All firms who want to work there have to fill it in. Your former employer, Acumen, has listed a number of clients that might have relevance to your new job, including Uber, the Drone Alliance Europe, and a company called Charge Up Europe, which I assume is something to do with charging electric vehicles. Do you have anything, therefore, additional to declare in terms of former associations in your work before that we might want to know about now for transparency purposes?
No, thank you. No, I don't. Those three companies that you mentioned, I never worked with them with my work at Acumen. At Acumen, I trained the CEO of a pharmaceutical company ahead of his appearance before the ENVI committee to sort of prepare him for the kind of questions he might have. I talked through the way in which policy would be developed with clients and the kind of concerns that individual MEPs might have and the political direction that they come from, but not with those companies at all. And actually, I think, you know, as part of the process of democracy, where you have open engagement with civil society as well as policymakers, it's important that you have a sensible system of dialogue. What is important, of course, is to ensure that you always put the public interest before everything else. And you mentioned Dieselgate. Yes, we did have a lot of representation from vehicle manufacturers. I had a lot more representation from groups like Transport and Environment, who obviously were campaigning for the strongest possible recommendations to be made. And ultimately, I think the proof is in the work that we did. We came up with strong recommendations to the Commission on how to fix the regulatory system in order that a Dieselgate scandal could never happen again. So yes, we heard from many OEMs who said, oh, it's far too expensive to transition away from the diesel engine that we've spent a lot of money and research on, and we think we can meet these standards without outrageous conformity factors and so on. We heard this time and time again, but ultimately, and by the way, I think it's important that OEMs in that instance had the ability to express their concern at the work that we were doing, because I think if you do any sort of policy making in a closed box without listening to people you don't necessarily agree with, you could end up with very bad policy. But again, look at the result, and I don't think there's a credible vehicle manufacturer anywhere now who would say that continuing with the internal combustion engine is the future.
Thank you. Another one from me, which is, what will you do as Deputy Chair of Transport for London to improve the transport network and the lives of Londoners? What are your ambitions?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So, I mean, it's all framed, again, around the transport strategy and that 80% target. Obviously, the three challenges I outlined are the challenges that will guide the work going forward, and the funding issue is first and foremost the most pressing concern. Let's assume that we're in a situation where the government is now committing to a long-term financial deal. We have some degree of certainty as to the way in which we can plan and look at capital projects and deliver on existing commitments, because that's also an essential part of receiving funding from the government to ensure that we can meet our commitments in other parts of the UK, for example, the factories in Goole and our suppliers in Falkirk and Northern Ireland. Let's assume that we have a good system of relationships with the various stakeholders that we have. That would then put us firmly on target to deliver on that 80% ambition. And that is really what I would be working towards. That is my ultimate ambition, is to see that work and to see it delivered. We can't continue in a situation where the default option is to get back in our cars and carry on as if that's the way forward. Yes, car use, car ridership, adequate, well-paved roads for cars will be an important part of the transport mix going forward. Inevitably, all of us will find our situations in a car at some point. but it cannot be the default and preferred option for Londoners to move around. We have to ensure that the transport system, the existing transport system, is not only is something that people have confidence and feel is reliable, but they also have a sense that we are investing in the future. So projects that at the moment we are having to put on hold, projects, by the way, that we've been talking about for a very long time, thinking obviously of the Bakerloo line extension, thinking obviously of Crossrail 2, projects now, unfortunately, that have had to go back on the shelf simply because it's impossible to countenance moving forward with them in the current financial situation. If we get that, I won't say, ideal scenario, but let's realistic scenario, as long as we get long-term funding, then those will be the kinds of ideas that I'd like to bring back onto the table to give Londoners confidence that it's not just a question of having the transport system that we have at the moment, but something in the future that will deliver an even better experience for Londoners.
Thanks very much. So, I mean, there's a lot there around challenging cultures, challenging government to a certain extent. One of your roles as Deputy Chair is going to be to challenge TfL to ensure that they are delivering on the Mayor's agenda. How will you do that?
Yes, you're right. It's not a question that we all sit around and we all have the same worldview and everything's fine. Of course not. But again, I go back to the management of relationships and ensuring that there is a very clear and open dialogue between all of us, including obviously members of the board and the executive at TfL, and of course City Hall and the London Assembly. We will all have ideas about what is going right and what is going wrong. And we will have frustrations, of course, as well as moments of excitement, I hope, as well, that will spur us on to generate ideas. And as long as we have a sensible and clear way of managing the relationships between us all and talking to each other and being open with each other, then I think we can have those disagreements, we can talk through those disagreements, and I think we can find a consensus going forward. The problem I find often is not that people disagree or that they have a different way of thinking about things. It's the lack of communication, the lack of comfort that people feel perhaps with having those discussions. And I can assure you I have no such discomfort. I am perfectly happy to have meetings with people who might assume, for instance, that I have a different view from the outset. That's not a problem for me. I know that there are very many stakeholders that we have to manage, from the workforce, of course, from the trade unions, through to management and members of the board, all of whom will have different experiences and different histories. And understanding that and accommodating that, I think, is core to ensuring a smooth flow for the relationships.
Thank you. And some of those stakeholders are local authorities who in my experience, feel sometimes that the operations of TfL are done unto them rather than with them. So how will you improve some of those relationships?
Yeah, that is obviously a feeling that people often get when you have two tiers of government. Certainly I'm familiar with that feeling in my previous role. As I say, the 95% of the roads in the capital are controlled by the boroughs, so it's not possible for us to meet the targets that we have and the vision that we have, that I think most of us, if not all of us here, share, without talking and engaging and getting a buy-in from the 32 boroughs in the City of London. It's essential that we have their involvement. Obviously, when it comes, I mean, a good example is active transport and the modal shift and increase in cycling provision, where boroughs have very different ideas on what is achievable. Often those ideas are, yes, based on ideology, although rarely, to be honest. In the main, the problems are much more fundamental and sort of procedural. To do with funding is a big issue, obviously. Boroughs have had a cut to their own funding. It's not just TfL, it's in a difficult position. Local councils obviously operating under extremely difficult circumstances. But also, obviously, different approaches and different consensuses within individual communities on things like low traffic neighbourhoods. And there is obvious disagreement in some parts of the city amongst different parts of individual boroughs on what the right solution is. And again, it's about engagement. It's about ensuring that nobody feels actually as if they are being told what to do from above, as it were. There is no real from above when it comes to the operation that we have, because, as I say, you need the cooperation of boroughs in order to achieve what we want to achieve. So working with the boroughs and ensuring that they feel that they have not only been listened to, but that their decisions are actually, they form part of the final outcome is essential.
Thank you. And I'm glad you checked the ideology issue, because, you know, all the boroughs have very different characteristics. If I can be parochial for a second, for example, one of the wards in Bromley, Darwin, is roughly the same size as Islington. So you have different challenges depending on those different local authorities, and that's why you need that communication. But we'll pick that up somewhere else. If I go to Assembly Member Ahmed. Oh. Well, if you do that quickly, and then we'll go to Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Seb. We're talking about engaging stakeholders and engaging boroughs. You didn't mention local residents. And change, of course, always affects local residents. So do you think it's important for TfL to listen and engage with individual local residents in an area? And how would you approach that?
Yes, thank you. Forgive me, when I mentioned local communities, that's what I was referring to, local residents. The different consensuses that are arrived at in different boroughs for different reasons. The Chair, you gave a good example in terms of geographical scope. Clearly there are different perceptions on what is possible in different parts of the city, and what might be applicable in one part of the city will not necessarily be applicable in others. So to answer your question, yes, it's essential to engage with local residents, but we have to remember that the boroughs primarily are the ones that are closest in terms of consultations and the decisions that are made, particularly, and again, low traffic neighbourhoods are a very good example of that, where the decisions that are made are often at a borough level, and we don't have the ability or indeed the desire to override in many cases what is being decided locally. So yes, it is important to engage with local residents, but also recognise that the boroughs are the ones who ultimately conduct the most forensic survey of residents and have the closest relationship with them.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and thank you, Assembly Member Ahmed, for your patience there.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Seb. The COVID-19 pandemic has upended how people work and travel in London. How will this impact your view of the role?
Yes, thank you for your question, and it's been an extraordinary time for everybody. Obviously, we don't know where we are in this pandemic. We've gone through many stages, we've gone through many different waves, and there are reasons, obviously, to be very optimistic. But one can never be sure what the future holds. And things have changed very quickly. We've already discussed in relation to finances how things can change extremely quickly. So the corollary of that is that I'm hopeful that things will change the other way as well extremely quickly, but we shall see. One of the things that obviously we are unsure about is the travel patterns that will follow the pandemic. It's interesting to see in the intervening periods between lockdowns what the travel patterns have been and how people have been using the transport network. And it's very true to say that the morning and evening peaks are very much reduced in terms of the obvious spike in travel that is the traditional pattern. But the weekend riderships are actually up quite significantly, which suggests that certainly people are using the transport system much more for leisure, much more for a whole range of activities that don't necessarily include travelling to and from work. Now, this is something of a theoretical discussion as to what the future of work will look like. Clearly, working from home is going to form a much bigger part, I think, of the way in which many people work, many people, not all, and it depends really on a whole range of factors, and TfL is modelling actually 4 different scenarios based on increases and decreases in particular types of travel, whether it be commuting, whether it be leisure travel, and so on. One thing I would say is that I don't think people will stop travelling and seeing each other. And I do think that a significant proportion of people who can work from home some of the time will still work from the office some of the time as well. It's becoming more and more common, I think, for employers to suggest a certain balance between days in the office and days working from home. But of course, there is a substantial workforce that cannot work from home. And many of those people, of course, work for our own transport system. We've lost 104 colleagues to COVID over the course of the pandemic. In fact, one colleague, sadly, during the very brief time that I've been deputy mayor, has lost his life. And my heart goes out to all of the families and the co-workers and colleagues of all of the staff and workers at TfL who have lost their lives on the front line of this pandemic. Hopefully going forward, we will see a stabilisation in travel patterns, obviously, but as I say, nobody knows what the future holds. But there are reasons to be cheerful that people will return back to the network and travel, even if it's a slightly different pattern.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing to our attention those figures of the number of TfL workers who've lost their lives, and I'm very sorry to hear about the most recent loss. Seb, you earlier outlined the three major challenges that you feel are most pertinent, and you talked about funding being the key to the other two. And as the Labour leader at City Hall on the economy, I was very gratified to hear you talking about the skeleton, the transport system being the skeleton for which everything that happens in London happens. You'll be familiar with last month's Transport for London and GLA economics report on the economic impacts under future funding scenarios for Transport for London, very sexily named. The report shows the total economic impact of moving to a managed decline scenario. The Mayor has no option, as we know, but to do this given the short-term funding settlements that are being given by government, and the decline could be over £12 billion over the next decade. Firstly, what do you think of the report's conclusions, and in your view, what would this mean for Londoners?
Yes, thank you. The report really puts into stark figures the potential impact on the economy. 12 billion is obviously a huge amount of money, but in terms of the differential between the funding that we need to receive and the impact on the economy, obviously it shows demonstrably that the government would be getting value for money and investing in the long term in our transport system. There cannot be a recovery in the UK without a London recovery as well. It's often fashionable to say that London should perhaps receive less funding or not be the focus of government attention in comparison to other areas. And I would say this, that yes, of course, there has been a huge divide in our country for a very long time, which is unacceptable. But it's not right to focus on London and say London shouldn't get what it needs. We should be looking at the gap, the economic gap, and focusing on closing that gap as much as possible. You can't do that if you close London off from the national recovery. We need investment in our transport system. We need assurances that the long-term future of the transport system is secure, because it's only through doing that that we can avoid, as you say, the managed decline scenarios, which would see drastic cuts to tube services, to bus services, and of course some of those services are the ones that the lowest income families depend on the most, particularly when you think about the bus network. It would take us backwards, not just in terms of our commitments to increase use of public transport and reduce carbon emissions, but also from a social equity point of view, it would affect the poorest the most. And that's something that we all have to avoid. And I'm certain there is no desire in government for that to happen. So I hope that we can now work together for a constructive outcome and avoid what this report very clearly states would be a severe economic hit to the capital and to the country.
Thank you, and I'm sure you recognise that 23% of the country's GDP is generated in London in the statistics that you've given. The report states that London's public transport network enables high employment density, which enhances business productivity, and then goes on to highlight the loss to businesses under the managed decline scenario. How do you plan to work with Rajesh Agrawal, the Deputy Mayor for Business, to help business deal with such a managed decline in the transport network?
Yes, thank you. I know that my predecessor had a great relationship with Rajesh, and that the importance of business to not just obviously the overall economic life of London, but TfL as well. We have some 2,500 tenants that work on property that is owned by TfL. So there is a clear link between the business health and the transport health of this city. And I know that in terms of selling London as the best place to do business, the transport system is a key part of that. And it's not just obviously the brand that is internationally renowned, that people have a lot of innate respect for, but actually the ability for investors and business to have confidence in this city as somewhere that they know they can live and work and get around and have a lot of faith in our underlying services. So yes, I intend to continue that good working relationship. I intend to work very closely with Rajesh and to make sure that we understand the fundamental importance of having a properly funded, well-run, well-managed and publicly overseen transport system. So yes, I look forward to continuing and building on that relationship.
Thank you. My final question. You referred earlier to the poorest communities in London being disproportionately affected by the managed decline, if that happens. These groups rely on London's buses more than any other mode of transport, and so the anticipated 18% reduction in bus services would hit them the hardest. How do you plan to work with Dr. Debbie Weeks-Barnard, the Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice, to help those communities deal with such a managed decline in that transport network?
Thank you. Yes. Obviously, we hope to avoid the managed decline scenario, but we have no option but to plan on the basis of the managed decline scenario as long as we don't have that long-term funding deal. Effectively, the short-term extensions allow us to stave off a managed decline scenario every time we get one, and we hope at the very least to have an extension in February, but obviously we want that long-term deal so that we don't have to then plan on a managed decline scenario. But you're right in identifying who those cuts will affect the most. And of course we will do everything we can to prioritise routes in areas where people have high dependency on bus services. We would look at reducing services in areas that have replication of transport routes elsewhere. That's predominantly in central London, but there are other areas as well. And we don't want to do this, of course, and it would significantly impact our ability to deliver on our targets for increase in ridership, but also, as I say, our environmental commitments as well. But there is also a social equity point when it comes to reducing the dependency on cars and the increase in provision of public transport options, which is that the poorest in London often are the least likely to have a car. Car ownership is obviously expensive in and of itself, but the dependency on transport systems, on public transport systems and active transport options is much higher among low-income families. So we don't want to see a situation where a managed decline scenario ends up impacting the poorest the most, and that's what I will be working with Debbie very, very hard to avoid. Obviously, I hope we don't have to enter that scenario, but we have to be pragmatic and accept that there is a very real possibility that that's the basis on which we have to operate over the next few months.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Something that occurred to me during that conversation in terms of challenges coming up were, of course, the ongoing tube strikes, which are scheduled to last right until summer. And the context of this is that drivers are upset about having to work up to 4 nights a year. What are your thoughts about that? How can we rebuild some of those relations?
Yes, I mean, first and foremost, the relationship that we have with the trade unions is a key pillar in establishing a healthy system whereby workers feel that they have the conditions they need to operate safely and that they feel that they have and rely on a safe and secure relationship with management. It's important that we have as good a relations as possible, and of course the trade union movement is pivotal in that. I mean, none of us would have paid holidays, none of us would have the right to avoid being summarily dismissed from our employment unless were it not for the work of the trade union movement over many years. So that essential relationship is a key pillar of the stakeholder management that I talked about earlier. But we also have to be able to disagree sometimes with trade unions where action is taken that we believe the premise isn't correct. And in this instance, this is unfortunately one of those areas where there is a real disagreement between the RMT in this particular instance and TfL and indeed City Hall. It's not the case that drivers will have to work a night shift. And it is not the case that any jobs will be lost. We've been very clear about that. No jobs will be lost, and where a driver wants to swap a night shift for a day shift, that will be possible. In fact, there are very many drivers who want to work a night shift and don't want to work a day shift. Obviously, people's preferences and patterns depend on what suits them effectively. And the system that is being proposed has been accepted by ASLEF and other trade unions without reservation. But in the case of the RMT, they continue to have reservations on this. So I would simply urge them to come back to the table to discuss this issue further, because we all want a situation where Londoners aren't negatively impacted, obviously, during this crucial period. But we have to recover from the pandemic. We have to build our way out of this pandemic. It's had a huge impact. We've talked about the economic impact. We haven't talked about the impact on our well-being and our mental health as well, which is obviously another key part of this pandemic that is often overlooked. Londoners want to feel that their city is getting back to life, and then the night tube is a key part of that. This is a wonderful, lively, beautiful city, and to see parts of it deserted at night when they've been thriving nighttime economies before, it breaks your heart. You want to see this city get out there and enjoy itself again. And that's why I would urge the RMT to come back to the table on this. I think, we have a resolution. We can work through this. I don't think the proposal is unreasonable, but we will see where we get to, and I'm very hopeful that the RMT will come back to the table.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the proposal is reasonable, and the option to swap out those night shifts, I think, is very reasonable. The importance of the night tube to keep people safe, especially for women and girls, that's all very vital. So it's what can change then to bring people back to the table, and it's what in your new role as deputy chair, what can you do to just drive that forward? What change can you make?
Well, again, I think dialogue is the key here. I mean, we all get very protective of the positions we have, and rightly so, because often we arrive at the decisions we arrive at because of firm convictions and a clear sense of purpose. But sometimes we get it wrong, or we might make misjudgments, and we might look for ways to effectively climb down from a position that we've taken. I know, for example, that within the RMT there are disagreements from station staff who have borne the brunt of some of the strike action. I mean, I should say, in terms of the impact on the night tube service, on the Victoria line, we've managed to run a near full service, and we've managed to run a service on the Central line as well throughout the operation of the night tube. Not as good as we would want on the Central line, but we have run a service, and in terms of the level of demand at the moment, it's certainly been more than adequate to meet the needs of Londoners travelling during night tube periods. But look, I would just say, the other unions have accepted it. There is disquiet, I know, amongst station staff who feel that they are often at the brunt of the additional problems caused by a reduced service on the night tube. And I'd say, look, let's just bury the hatchet, as it were, come back to the table. It doesn't matter that we've had disagreements on this particular issue. That's what happens. People disagree all the time, but let's talk, let's find a way forward, and I think we can come up with an option that most people will be happy with.
Thanks very much. That's encouraging to hear. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Seb. You already been asked about the challenges in this role and for TfL, but also opportunities. So what is the biggest opportunity in your view for you as Deputy Chair over the coming term?
Thank you, Umesh, for the positive question. I'm very grateful. Clearly, the challenges are legion, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I do very much feel, even after the short-term that I've been deputy mayor, and I felt this in the run-up as well, in the discussions I'd had with Heidi and others as well, that the positives far outweigh the negatives. I mean, there are obvious immediate opportunities. The Elizabeth line will open very soon. And that will transform the way in which many people, particularly from eastern and southeastern London, speaking as a southeast Londoner, have a vested interest in this as well, that will transform the way in which people travel around our city, and will have a transformative effect also on the way in which people come into our city, and also hopefully when the three sections are linked up, will also transform some of the revenue that we receive, where people previously travelling on non-TfL services will switch to TfL services. But in terms of the general opportunities, I return to the central aims of this role in this mayoralty, which is to establish a modal shift in the way in which we think about travelling around our city. If we get this right, just imagine a situation where your high street is not clogged up with polluting vehicles, but is a shared space for people and families to use and feel confident in using. A place where deaths from collisions from TfL vehicles, buses, and other vehicles that we use is zero. That people feel that there is a proper interplay between our streetscape and the way in which we move about. Where there is confidence in the public transport system as a reliable option, where people walk, as I say, at least 20 minutes a day, and we reduce the burden on the NHS, we increase our health, and we reduce the incidences of cancer and diabetes and all the other effects, because not only are we exercising more, but we're breathing cleaner air. If you think about transforming the way that our city operates, just think what that could do globally if London leads the way as it has in so many other areas. Now, we invented mass transit my maths isn't that great, 149 years ago, almost to the day actually, when the Metropolitan Railway as it was then, first opened. We invented the solution 149 years ago. The car revolution is a blip. It's not the blueprint for what the future of the city will be. And I think returning to the vision of mass transit, democratic travel, if you like, is going to be a huge boon for our city. And if we export that, we can do a huge amount in reducing global emissions. And people will always say it was London that did it first. What London does today, the rest of the world will do tomorrow.
Thank you. My next question, to some extent, has already been answered. The question is about working with partners, often with diverging agendas. I think you, earlier in the morning, you talked about working with cities when you were an MEP, with mayors, and you've just been asked a question about working with the trade unions. But is there any particular experience that you wish to draw to attention that you have of influencing partners to work with you to help deliver on transport commitments? I mean, is there anything else you want to add to what you already said, or?
Yeah, I think I do. I mentioned the sort of formal stakeholders, if you like, but we have to bring the travelling public with us as well. I mean, there is a huge mind shift, I think, that is required, and this is bigger than the role of Deputy Chair of TfL. It's something that involves all of us. It's something that involves every layer of policy making, not just in London, but nationally and internationally as well. If you think, in relation to recycling, to give an example, it's almost socially unacceptable to admit that you don't recycle, and good, right? I mean, this is a small thing that we can all do in order to transform our world and to establish better practice and to get new generations innately understanding their responsibilities. But I think the same thing is needed in relation to the way we travel about and our relationship with each other in terms of the decisions we make when we travel about. A car takes up a lot of space, about 10 square meters, size of an average bathroom, in fact, slightly bigger than an average bathroom in London. If we all decided to take up that space, none of us would be able to get anywhere. We would very quickly get gridlock. And understanding that there is a social element as well as an environmental element to the way in which we travel, I think is a key shift that we need to get to. So I would add that challenging people sometimes on some of the assumptions they make about travel is going to be an important part going forward.
And my final question, again, to some extent, you already answered this question. I think the chair asked you about working with London's boroughs, but can I put it to Seb, very specifically, how will you seek to work with Andy Byford and the rest of the TfL leadership to progress the transport projects the boroughs most need? I mean, you got the proposed DLR extension to Thamesmead, the Bakerloo line extension. So obviously individual boroughs have their own aspirations around transport. The part of London that I represent, I always the case for a river crossing further out east, which was there on the Mayor Livingston's agenda, or a DLR up, not across the river, but along the river from Beckton to Barking Riverside. I mean, if you don't talk about these projects now, we never will. I know, I appreciate the financial issues that TfL faces, but specifically, how will you see yourself working with Andy and the rest of the TfL leadership team?
Yes, I mean, I hate to start with the financial question, but that is, as I say, and remains throughout the principal challenge. I also go back to what do I say about what I said earlier about the optimism that I have. I mean, that if you think about the shared interests that everybody has, government, number 10, Whitehall, government's often quite complex, but number 10, Whitehall, and of course, City Hall, Londoners, the Mayor, the London Assembly, it all converges in the middle. Nobody wants to see the transport system grind to a halt. Nobody wants to see this fail, and for very much more unpalatable options to then be have to be considered in terms of goodness knows what would happen. But certainly the government doesn't want to return to direct control, for example, of our transport system. So that has to be the central question. But you're right. That doesn't mean that we don't then talk about a better context that we want to operate in. Yes, we're moving through the pandemic. There will be an economic recovery. That recovery has to be led through active and proper investment in the transport system. So, a different scenario really isn't fathomable, as it were, in the medium to longer term. And yes, we then will work very closely with the boroughs to determine where those key infrastructure projects are decided. I'm struck by the fact that it was only a few years ago when we were talking in very clear terms about the imminent nature of some of these projects. They were at the very advanced stage of planning. They still are, but they're now on a shelf, as it were. And the hope is that when the financial situation improves, we can take them back off the shelf and put them back into the planning process, but we simply can't do it at the moment. But yes, working very closely with the Commissioner, with the boroughs, and identifying new areas as well, because of course nothing stands still. The ideas that we have now are not necessarily the same ideas that we'll have in a few years for what will improve the lives of Londoners. So that active engagement, managing that relationship very closely is core to what I want to do.
And finally, Chair, this is not a question, but I'm sure you've got lots of reading materials, reading to go through. Can I just draw to your attention a publication I did 3 years ago, London Moving East, which talks about some of the transport issues and challenges and opportunities, of course.
Absolutely. It's actually on my bookshelf. Would you believe it? I actually have it. You gave it to me at an event we were at. But yes, most definitely. Most definitely.
In that case, watch out for the update coming out soon.
Great. I look forward to it.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much and well plugged. I am pleased you have committed to staying to the end of this mayoral term. When you do have another interview, saying I'm not that good at maths is not a fantastic thing to say, especially when you're negotiating big bailouts. But we're now going live via satellite to Assembly Member Pigeon.
Lovely, thank you very much. And I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but it's been a really interesting confirmation hearing so far, and it's good to hear your views on different things, Seb, and experience. In terms of working with government, that's going to be crucial, and you've already touched on that a lot this morning. I wonder if you've got a specific example you might be able to give us where you've had a success in that sort of negotiation with government or equivalent, and how you use the skills that you've outlined this morning. And perhaps you could also tell us what discussions you've already started to have with government or what you have lined up.
Yeah, thank you, Assembly Member Pigeon, for your question. And, it's good to see you. Yes, I do have direct experience of dealing with. I'm right to look at the screen here. Is that? Yeah. So, I do have direct experience of dealing with government in both proactive and also reactive in terms of defending a position as well, because I think that's an important component of the work that we will need to do in terms of actively changing positions. When I was at ActionAid UK, the core strategy that I helped develop was to build unusual alliances for what we were trying to achieve. We were trying to achieve a global initiative on tax avoidance and working with other countries to reduce the ability of multinational companies to funnel funds around and effectively park in hidden places the money that should be going in tax revenue. And lots of people said, oh, it's impossible to influence the government because they have a particular way of thinking, and you could never talk to the Treasury because they're so entrenched. And certainly the then Chancellor of the Exchequer wouldn't possibly countenance what we were talking about. And there's a perception of the NGOs that we were working with as being of a certain political persuasion. Therefore, you immediately face this barrier. And actually, what we did was we built that coalition of NGOs from across the board, working on a whole range of different issues. We were concentrating on advocacy as a route out of poverty, but there were other NGOs looking at different theories and different ways and working on different areas. And we got meetings with government, we got sympathetic meetings with government. Initial skepticism gave way to recognition of where the shared goals were. And I think that's the key thing. In everything, people come at things from a different position, they have a different background, they have a different history, but actually there are many shared agendas in a lot of these issues. And of course, the shared agenda here, quite frankly, which we were at pains to point out, and the penny dropped when we did, was that the UK revenue was missing out on an awful lot of income that it should otherwise be collecting. And the result, therefore, was a commitment at the G20 summit in Northern Ireland that was held that year. For a global initiative on tax avoidance. And I think it's paved the way for a lot of the work that's been carried on since at regulatory level to try and address the problems to do with tax avoidance. So I'm proud of the work that we did. I played a very small part in changing government's position, but the part that I played was nonetheless to identify the opportunities. And the second example I just want to quickly give in terms of reaction, as a member of the European Parliament dealing with environmental regulation, I was often subject to approach from UK government to water down some of the proposals that we had. I was very clear in the position that we took that we had support, as I say, from the cities that we were talking about, including, of course, cities in the UK. It's not easy to say no to your own government, especially when they've made the effort to come and approach you directly. But being firm as well with government in terms of the principles that we have and the need for action as well is an important part of it. So both proactive and reactive, I've demonstrated that I can certainly hold my own.
That's really good to hear, and that's a good example. You've talked a lot about air pollution this morning and the significant work you've done in this area. What further steps do you think are needed to tackle air pollution in the capital, and particularly what might you look to do to mitigate air quality issues associated with Transport for London's construction projects?
I was going to say construction projects, and then you gave the example. That's spot on. I mean, look, in terms of the work that we do at a macro level, of course, having the right emission standards for London is essential. So that's clearly the ULEZ is a massive part in ensuring compliance, and that's had a significant impact also on construction, the impact of construction on air quality, with heavy vehicles necessarily now conforming to standards that they didn't before, and that's had a big impact on reducing NOx levels in particular. But there are many different associated areas, and I think when you get the macro policy right, you look at ways of doubling down, if you like, and building on that. But you then also have to deal with the periphery concerns that often aren't mentioned when it comes to when it comes to air quality. The use of vehicles travelling to sites, for example, is another issue. As well as the use of machinery itself when it comes to construction. There are alternatives available. I've seen them in Oslo, for example, where they had a huge procurement of zero-emission, non-road mobile machinery. And often, the common refrain was, but these big machines, they need diesel, they need heavy fuel oil in order to operate. You can't possibly, the technology exists. And of course, at the beginning, it's expensive, but the more cities procure, the cheaper it gets. And the first mover advantage, if you like, is that you get to be a world leader. Perhaps Oslo's stolen a slight lead when it comes to non-road mobile machinery, but it's proven that it's there. It works. The alternatives are there. And I think working on the peripheral issues, the areas that perhaps aren't covered by the macro policy, is a key next step in terms of dealing with air quality in our city.
That's a really interesting example. And on a similar vein, TfL leads a group of UK authorities in the Joint Initiative for Hydrogen Vehicles Across Europe project. Do you think using that and your European background and contacts, you could help ensure that we deliver more zero-emission buses in London through this, using that network to reduce the cost through joint procurement?
Absolutely, I very much hope so. The issue of procurement is obviously a complicated one, and as soon as you start to look into the different ways in which local authorities procure vehicles and procure services, it obviously gets quite complicated. I don't want to mention the B word, but Brexit might add a further layer of complication. But no, but certainly you're right. We can work with those networks, whatever the wider context. There are and there is a group led by my colleague Shirley Rodriguez, the Deputy Mayor for the Environment, that focuses on air quality. And in fact, we have a meeting this week where we will discuss a number of different initiatives looking at potential policy levers in changing the way in which we can regulate air quality in the city. But yes, one of the areas I think we could look at is working, and will look at, is working with other cities to get those economies of scale when it comes to new fleets. Of course, with hydrogen, we have to be very clear about the source of the hydrogen as well, because there are different types of hydrogen. Some is produced through the use of fossil fuels, and green hydrogen is produced obviously through renewable sources, and that's what we're working towards, to ensure that both the vehicles are zero emission, but that the source of the energy is also carbon neutral.
Lovely, thank you. And we've talked a lot this morning about the Mayor's transport strategy. One area that's not really clear is car clubs, and what I'd like to know what your view is on car clubs and what role they play in the city. Many people feel that TfL is rather indifferent to their expansion, yet actually they have a key role in getting many vehicles, privately owned cars, off the road so people can occasionally use one when they need it. What's your view on this? And do you accept they make a net reduction in car miles in London?
Yes, I do accept that they have a role to play. And I'm afraid I don't have any figures in terms of the numbers of cars that have been removed from private ownership on account of car clubs, but clearly they are a popular option, and you only need to look around different boroughs to see the amount of car parking space that is specifically earmarked for car clubs to see that there clearly is a demand, and rightly so. I mean, obviously when it comes to the last mile, if you like, of a journey, the focus has to be on active transport options for people. For example, in every journey that's taken in Greater London, it's a third of all journeys that are undertaken by car at the moment could be undertaken on foot in less than 25 minutes, and 2/3 could be undertaken by bike in under 30 minutes. So there is clearly room for a substantial shift. But clearly, if you're moving house, if you're transporting heavy equipment, if the distance involved is simply impractical for whatever reason, then obviously car clubs, black cabs, zero emission, of course, in both instances, will of course play a big role in delivering that additional last mile journey, if you like. So yes, I believe they do have a very real role to play.
That's great to hear. And finally, from me, I'd like to know how you see your role working with the London Assembly's Transport Committee, whether you've looked at any of our recent reports over the last few years and your thoughts on that relationship and our work.
Absolutely. The Transport Committee, of course, plays the most crucial role in terms of the level of scrutiny that the Assembly can put on TfL and on the Mayor in terms of delivering on our commitments and indeed your priorities as well. So I will work incredibly closely with the Transport Committee, and indeed the reports that you produce are of the highest quality and very much not just taken into account, but the recommendations you make will form a key part in our strategy and proposals going forward.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I invite Assembly Member Moima?
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Seb. My questions are very much on that procurement theme and looking at the role of TfL and its funding and how, impacting levelling down of London is actually having really negative impact on the rest of the country. So I think about Switch Mobility, where 85% of their orders they supply TfL. Those are obviously at risk because of these attempts to level down TfL and by implication the rest of the city. But in order to meet your ambitions, I know that TfL has told the government that they need £1 to £1.5 billion of additional government investment each year. And I'm just wondering, and you've touched on it already, how will you seek to convince ministers that providing that level of investment funding will support their own policy ambitions for the UK? We're obviously trying to convince them, of your role of supporting supply chains and jobs in the rest of the country.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's a core part of what we need to do to address the key challenge that we have. I should have said, sorry, in a previous answer that I have actually had a meeting with the Minister already, and it was a productive meeting, and I think it was important to establish a sense that we can talk freely and frankly with each other without sort of slight embarrassment over whatever, political histories or whatever. It's irrelevant, frankly, in this instance. We need to work together to deliver for London. And you're right, the £1.5 billion shortfall results from effectively the pandemic having slashed our income, but it doesn't mean that even if we got fair income back to what it was, we would still have a problem because, of course, you plan on an ongoing basis. So we're much further behind where we would have been had the pandemic not hit. And that gap is the problem going forward. It means that we have difficulty in planning for anything other than a managed decline scenario on the basis of not having that long-term assurances. So that's absolutely the principal aim. And you're right as well to identify the fact that this is not just a London problem. 55 pence of every pound that is spent by London Underground goes to other parts of the country. Other contracts that we have signed support in the region of 43,000 jobs across the country. I've mentioned suppliers in Goole, I've mentioned suppliers in Falkirk, in Northern Ireland as well. So all parts of the UK benefit from a healthy and fully supported transport system. And I said to the Minister, and the point is obvious, I think, and well received. We're not talking about a London-only recovery. We're not even talking about a London-led recovery, but we do need a London-inclusive recovery. It is impossible to have a situation where London is excluded from the investment that it needs, that the rest of the country needs. And the point that I think we stress at all times on government is that, we are part of a interconnected system. The UK depends on the capital being successful. And it's the gap between the UK and the rest of the country that should be the focus of the attention, not the fact that the capital itself should and deserves to be a success.
Thank you. And so my second question, I'm sure that you know that the Mayor said, just to quote him, "When I was signed in for my second term, I pledged to build bridges between London and the rest of our country and to showcase how London can help the national recovery and the levelling up agenda." So what is your assessment of the priorities the UK's nations and regions have, and how that compares to and can be worked alongside TfL's?
That's a great question, and I'm pleased you raised the other parts of the country, the devolved administrations, but also, of course, working with regions and cities in the rest of England as well. The focus, I think, on the last few years has been about the divisions that exist between north and south, east and west, town and country, and all the rest of it. And it's formed such a huge part of our politics. But the reality is, this pandemic, as awful as it is, has, I think, shone a light on what unites us and what the shared endeavours and the shared goals and aims are. And I think, when it comes to, when you think about the devolved administrations in Scotland, in Wales and in Northern Ireland, they have a lot of common goals and aims that we have. None of our partners elsewhere in the UK wants to see a reduction in capacity for public transport. You don't hear anybody say, oh, we want fewer buses, or we want them to be, we want to focus actually on a car-led recovery. We don't need investment in our transport system, and we certainly wouldn't want, a transport system akin to the one that the capital wants. That's certainly not in our interest. You never hear that. Why would you hear that? Because it would be perverse, frankly, for anyone to want to disinvest in public transport and the network that is at the core of everything. So I think we can do a lot working with city mayors and with the devolved administrations and the metro mayors as well. And it doesn't matter what political persuasion they are. I know that we will be working with Andy Street, for example, in Birmingham. I know that we will be working with the Scottish Government in Edinburgh, as well as the Welsh Government in Cardiff and the Northern Ireland Assembly as well. All of these relationships are key. And I think we have to make the strongest case, frankly, that we can make to government is that we're all in this together, that we are all part of an interconnected United Kingdom, and that we've all suffered, frankly. Every single one of our component parts has suffered, and we deserve to look for the best possible provision of public services going forward. I would appeal to the government's sense of unity on this, because I think, ultimately they want the same thing as well. They don't want to see us break apart and fall apart and argue amongst ourselves and say, well, because they got this, we should get that. Well, they shouldn't get that because we want this. Nobody wins in a race to the bottom. It has to be a race to the top.
Thank you very much. I don't believe there are any other questions. So at this point, can I thank Seb for attending today's meeting and for his helpful contributions. You're now free to leave the meeting if you want, but you're also equally welcome to sit there and listen to us dissect you. So it's up to you.
I'm intrigued. I think I'll stay for just a little bit if I may.
Well, the committee is now required to make a decision on its recommendation to the Mayor as to whether or not the nominee should be appointed as Deputy Chair of Transport for London. I didn't detect any major concerns during the meeting. Caroline Pidgeon, Assemblymember Pidgeon, I see your hand raised.
I don't know whether we normally just have a discussion. I know I don't have a vote on this today, but I thought it was a very strong performance, showed really strong negotiation with government and key partners, which is going to be so essential at the moment. So I would strongly support the appointment.
Well, Seb, I think that's a maybe. If I see any concerns around the table, then I would suggest a possible resolution is that it be agreed to recommend that the Mayor should proceed with his appointment of Seb Dance to the office of Deputy Chair of Transport of London. Are we all agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. In that case, a letter will be sent to the Mayor following this meeting to confirm the committee's recommendation. As I have no other business, that concludes today's meeting. Thank you.